Hey everyone, this story begins in the quiet space between doubt and determination, the moment where laughter from others feels louder than your own heartbeat, and yet something inside you refuses to shrink. This is not just a story about money. This is a story about vision, patience, and the kind of power that grows silently before it ever announces itself. If stories of underestimated queens rising from nothing fuel your spirit, take a second to like, subscribe, and stay connected because this journey is one you will feel in your bones. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where overlooked beginnings turn into undeniable victories. The world has a strange way of measuring worth. It looks at numbers first, titles second, and confidence last. When the number is small, the judgment is instant. $100 does not look like ambition. It looks like a joke. It looks like something easily dismissed, something people feel comfortable laughing at because it threatens nothing and no one. But what the world often forgets is that power is not born from size. It is born from intention. The $100 came from sacrifice, not excess. It was saved slowly, intentionally, pulled from moments where comfort was delayed and convenience was denied. It represented discipline, not luck. Yet when it was finally placed on the table of possibility, it was met with smirks and quiet amusement. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It carried the familiar tone of people who believe they already understand how the story ends. That moment could have planted shame. It could have turned into retreat. But instead it planted resolve. Because queens do not rise by asking permission, and they do not abandon their visions simply because others cannot see it yet. The laughter became background noise and the $100 became a seed. This was not about chasing quick wins or flashy success. It was about learning, watching, and understanding how systems work when no one is cheering. Late nights were spent studying patterns, absorbing knowledge, and building clarity. Every mistake was treated like tuition, every small gain like confirmation. The focus was never on impressing anyone. It was on becoming undeniable. The early days were quiet. No one checked in. No one asked for updates. The absence of attention was almost a gift. It created space to grow without interference. The $100 moved carefully, intentionally, tested in small ways, protected from ego and impatience. Where others rushed, this approach waited. Where others gambled, this one calculated. There were moments of doubt, of course. Doubt is part of every transformation. But doubt was never allowed to drive decisions. It was acknowledged, then set aside. The goal was never just to multiply money. It was to prove something deeper. That consistency beats confidence. That discipline outlasts hype. That a queen who knows her worth does not need applause to proceed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the seed began to respond. Small returns appeared, not dramatic enough to announce, but real enough to confirm direction. Each increase strengthened belief, not arrogance. The $100 was no longer just money. It was proof of concept. It was evidence that the system worked when respected. Meanwhile, the laughter continued elsewhere. Life went on. People remained comfortable in their assumptions. They still believed nothing significant could come from such a small beginning. And that belief kept them exactly where they were. Watching. Judging. Waiting for proof they would never actively create themselves. What they didn't see was the shift happening internally. Confidence was no longer borrowed from motivation or inspiration. It was built from repetition. From showing up daily. From making decisions aligned with long-term vision instead of short-term validation. This was the quiet forging of authority. By the time the first meaningful growth appeared, it was already too late to stop the momentum. The foundation was laid. The mindset was locked. The queen had learned how to move in silence. And silence, when paired with intention, becomes dangerous to those who underestimate it. This chapter is not about the outcome yet. It is about the moment of choosing belief over embarrassment. About understanding that greatness often starts where no one is watching. The $100 was never the limitation. The only limitation would have been believing the laughter. As the seed settled deeper into its purpose, something became clear. This was never meant to be a quick flip. It was meant to be a transformation. A statement. A reminder that when a queen commits fully to her rise, even the smallest start can become unstoppable. And just as the ground began to crack with promise, as the quiet work started to prepare for something far bigger, the story paused at the edge of change, ready to unfold what discipline, patience, and belief would turn that $100 into next. The second chapter of the rise did not begin with celebration. It began with repetition. The kind of repetition that tests patience and exposes commitment. What had once been $100 was no longer just a seed. It was now a responsibility. Every move mattered more because progress, even small progress, creates pressure. Pressure to rush. Pressure to prove. Pressure to announce. But restraint remained the greatest weapon. Growth did not arrive in dramatic leaps. It came in increments so modest they could be ignored by anyone looking for spectacle. The balance shifted slowly, almost shyly, climbing in ways that demanded attention to detail rather than excitement. Each increase reinforced one truth. Consistency compounds when ego stays out of the way. This was not about chasing every opportunity. It was about choosing the right ones and walking away from distractions dressed up as shortcuts. There were temptations everywhere. Promises of fast returns. Voices claiming secret formulas and guaranteed wins. But discernment had been sharpened in silence. Not every door deserved to be opened, and not every opportunity aligned with the vision being built. The queen learned to say no without explanation. Power grew every time discipline overruled desire. Mistakes still happened, but they no longer felt like failures. They became data. Every loss was dissected not emotionally but analytically. Why did it happen? What signal was missed? What lesson was hidden inside it? This approach transformed setbacks into strategy. Nothing was wasted. Even missteps served the mission. Time became an ally rather than an enemy. While others measured success by speed, this journey measured it by sustainability. The numbers slowly increased, and with them came confidence that did not need to announce itself. There was no urge to prove anything to anyone. The proof was being built quietly, brick by brick. What changed most during this phase was perspective. Money was no longer the prize. Control was. Control over decisions. Control over emotions. Control over direction. That control created calm, and calm created clarity. Every move was intentional, rooted in knowledge rather than impulse. Externally, nothing appeared different. Life looked the same to those watching from the outside. That invisibility became a shield. There were no expectations to manage, no opinions to fight. The work continued uninterrupted, protected by the assumption that nothing important was happening. Underestimation became camouflage. Internally, however, transformation was undeniable. Confidence matured. It was no longer loud or defensive. It was steady, quiet, certain. The queen began to trust her judgment deeply, not because it was flawless, but because it was informed. Each decision was backed by research, reflection, and restraint. The balance crossed thresholds that once seemed distant. Not enough to celebrate publicly, but enough to acknowledge privately. These moments were marked not by excitement but by gratitude. Gratitude for patience. Gratitude for restraint. Gratitude for ignoring the laughter at the beginning. With growth came responsibility to protect what had been built. Risk management became sacred. Gains were guarded, not flaunted. The goal was no longer just growth but preservation. This mindset separated builders from gamblers. Builders think in systems. Gamblers think in moments. The journey also demanded isolation. Growth requires solitude at times because not everyone understands the discipline required to stay focused when progress is slow. Conversations were limited. Energy was conserved. Attention was directed inward toward strategy rather than validation. As the numbers continued to rise, something subtle but powerful shifted. The $100 story was fading. Not because it was forgotten but because it had evolved. It was no longer about proving that a small amount could grow. It was about proving that a small start, when paired with an unshakable mindset, could rewrite outcomes entirely. This chapter was defined by unseen effort. By nights spent refining strategy. By days spent observing rather than reacting. By the quiet confidence of knowing progress was happening even when no one noticed. This was the phase where most people quit, bored by the lack of excitement, discouraged by the absence of applause. But queens understand something others don't. They understand that roots must grow deep before anything rises above ground. They understand that silence is not stagnation. It is preparation. By the end of this chapter, the foundation was no longer fragile. It was firm. The momentum was real. The growth was undeniable to the one who mattered most. And as the journey approached a turning point, the stage was set for the moment when quiet progress would begin to attract unavoidable attention. The rise was no longer theoretical. It was happening. And soon it would no longer be possible to laugh. The moment when quiet progress began to carry weight. What once moved invisibly now shifted the atmosphere, subtle but undeniable. The growth had reached a point where it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or luck, even though no announcement had been made. This was the phase where silence stopped being harmless and started becoming unsettling to those who underestimated the journey. The balance no longer crept. It advanced. Still controlled, still intentional, but unmistakably forward. Each gain reinforced the system that had been carefully built over time. This was no longer an experiment. It was execution. The discipline that once felt heavy now felt natural, automatic, woven into daily rhythm. Decisions were made calmly, without rush, without fear, without the need for reassurance. What made this phase powerful was not just the numbers. It was the composure behind them. There was no panic during dips, no euphoria during rises. Emotional neutrality became a superpower. While others reacted to noise, this approach stayed focused on signal. The Queen had learned how to observe without attachment, how to move without broadcasting intention. The outside world began to change its tone, even if subtly. Curiosity replaced amusement. Questions replaced jokes. The same people who once laughed now watched more closely, trying to understand what they had missed. But access had already been revoked. Not intentionally but naturally. Growth creates distance. Not out of arrogance but out of alignment. This chapter demanded stronger boundaries. Attention became a currency that had to be spent wisely. Not everyone deserved insight into the process. Not everyone needed updates. The journey was protected fiercely because exposure too early can weaken momentum. The Queen understood that visibility is powerful only when paired with readiness. With growth came pressure, but it was a different kind of pressure. Not the pressure to prove, but the pressure to maintain integrity. Every decision now carried more weight. Sloppiness was no longer an option. Precision became non-negotiable. The system had to work not just once but consistently. The $100 origin story remained a quiet reminder, a grounding force. Kept ego in check. It reminded the Queen why patience mattered. Why shortcuts were rejected. Why every gain was respected. This humility protected the rise from collapsing under its own weight. There were moments in this chapter where temptation returned, louder than before. Bigger opportunities appeared. Riskier moves promised faster growth. The difference now was discernment. The Queen could see the cost beneath the offer. Speed often demanded sacrifice, and not all sacrifices were worth making. Longevity remained the goal. Confidence had fully transformed. It no longer sought confirmation. It no longer wavered. It existed as certainty. Not loud certainty but settled certainty. The kind that allows one to walk away from anything that does not align, without explanation or regret. This was also the chapter where identity shifted. No longer someone trying to succeed, the Queen began to operate as someone who expected success. This subtle internal shift changed everything. Decisions came from a place of ownership, not hope. From strategy, not desperation. The growth crossed milestones that once felt ambitious. Each milestone was acknowledged quietly, with gratitude rather than celebration. Celebration was postponed. The real celebration would come when the mission was complete. Until then, focus remained locked. Others began to sense the change. The laughter stopped entirely. Silence replaced it. And silence, in this context, was louder than any mockery had ever been. Silence meant recognition. Silence meant recalculation. Silence meant the story was no longer entertaining. It was threatening. This chapter was defined by authority earned, not claimed. By power built, not borrowed. By a presence that no longer needed to explain itself. The Queen had stepped into a new level, one where underestimation was no longer possible, even if acknowledgement had not yet been spoken aloud. As the journey approached its most critical turning point, one truth stood above all others. The rise was no longer fragile. It was fortified. And what comes next, once momentum meets opportunity, is transformation that cannot be ignored. The ground had fully shifted. The silence had spoken. And the next chapter would reveal what happens when preparation finally meets expansion. Chapter 4 arrived not with surprise but with readiness. This was the phase the quiet work had been preparing for all along. Expansion did not feel chaotic or overwhelming, because it had been rehearsed in discipline long before it ever appeared in reality. What changed now was scale. The system that once handled small movements was tested with larger weight and it held firm. The growth accelerated, not recklessly but decisively. Opportunities that once would have felt intimidating now appeared manageable, even obvious. This was not luck revealing itself. It was alignment revealing itself. The Queen had positioned herself so precisely that expansion felt like a natural next step rather than a dangerous leap. With scale came visibility, even without intentional exposure. Results have a way of speaking when silence has done enough work. Numbers reached levels that could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. What had once been a private journey now brushed against public awareness. Not announced, not promoted, simply noticed. This was where many falter. Expansion often invites ego and ego invites collapse. But the foundation built in earlier chapters proved its worth. The same discipline applied at $100 was applied now. The same patience. The same caution. The same respect for the process. Growth did not change the rules. It rewarded those who followed them. The Queen became increasingly selective. Not just with opportunities but with energy. Expansion requires protection. Too many voices create distortion. Too much input weakens intuition. Focus narrowed not out of fear but out of mastery. The mission was clear and anything that did not serve it was quietly dismissed. There was a noticeable shift in how others responded now. Admiration replaced curiosity. Assumptions replaced questions. People began to speak as if success had always been inevitable, as if they had seen it coming all along. This revision of history was expected. It was also irrelevant. The journey had never been about recognition. It was about sovereignty. Internally, something profound settled in. The need to prove anything dissolved completely. Validation lost its appeal. The rise had become self-sustaining. Confidence no longer reacted to external perception. It existed independently, anchored in evidence, discipline, and lived experience. The money itself transformed in meaning. It was no longer a scorecard. It was a tool. A resource that expanded choice, reduced dependence, and reinforced freedom. Every dollar carried intention. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed. Control remained absolute. This chapter also revealed the cost of rising. Distance grew naturally between those aligned with the journey and those who were not. Some relationships faded, not dramatically but quietly. Growth changes frequency. Not everyone can follow when elevation demands evolution. There was no bitterness in this realization. Only acceptance. The Queen understood now that expansion without apology was not arrogance. It was self-respect. It was honoring the work that had been done in silence. It was refusing to shrink to make others comfortable. The laughter from the beginning no longer mattered. It had been replaced by something far more powerful, undeniable presence. Milestones were crossed that once felt unreachable. 5 figures no longer seemed distant. They felt earned. Each step upward confirmed that the strategy worked at every level when applied with consistency. This was no longer about potential. It was about performance. Still, caution remained. Overconfidence is a subtle enemy. The Queen stayed grounded by remembering the beginning. The $100. The sacrifice. The discipline. That memory kept decisions clean and intentions sharp. Humility was not weakness. It was armor. The system evolved as scale increased. Adjustments were made. Strategies refined. What worked at one level was upgraded for the next. This adaptability ensured longevity. Growth was not treated as a finish line, but as an ongoing responsibility. Others now spoke of the journey in tones of inspiration. Some felt motivated. Others felt exposed. Success has that effect. It mirrors back what people believe is possible for themselves. The Queen did not manage those reactions. He did not need to. Her only responsibility was to remain aligned with her path. The transformation was nearly complete. The $100 investment had grown into something substantial, something solid, something real. The final stage was no longer about building momentum. It was about revealing the result. The rise was complete in form, if not yet in full revelation. The next chapter would not be about growth. It would be about arrival. About the moment when laughter turns into silence, silence into recognition, and recognition into legacy. This was not a moment of spectacle or sudden revelation. It was the natural culmination of years spent in discipline, patience, and relentless focus. The $100 seed, once dismissed, had become a force that could no longer be ignored. What had begun as a laughable gesture of ambition had transformed into undeniable authority. By now the numbers spoke for themselves. They were no longer increments on a ledger but evidence of strategic mastery. Every calculation, every carefully considered move, every sacrifice that had felt small at the time had compounded into a fortune that defied the initial expectations. The queen had not simply multiplied money. She had multiplied her influence, her clarity, and her sense of sovereignty. Success was no longer theoretical, it was tangible. The world that had once laughed now shifted. Those who had doubted, dismissed, or minimized the potential of $100 start were forced into reflection. Some remained silent, confronted with the quiet proof of their misjudgment. Others, the opportunists and critics, adjusted their narratives to fit the reality they had ignored. The laughter that had once echoed in the background had vanished completely. It had no place here. Silence had become the loudest response. What defined this chapter was not just the wealth gained, but the transformation that accompanied it. Confidence had evolved into authority, patience had become instinct, and discipline had solidified into identity. The queen moved differently now, not arrogantly, but with a presence that demanded acknowledgement without needing to announce it. Every action, every decision resonated with intention. This was sovereignty in motion. The $100 investment, once underestimated, had become symbolic. It represented vision, courage, and the audacity to believe in oneself when the world doubted. It reminded the queen of the origin of her power. The quiet moments of study, the calculated risks, the restraint in the face of distraction. Each success carried the imprint of that beginning. Nothing was accidental. Everything was earned. By now, the queen's network and influence began to grow organically. People who once ignored her sought insight. Mentors and peers noticed her consistency. The system she had perfected scaled elegantly, proving that small beginnings, when combined with disciplined execution, could produce exponential results. It was no longer about proving others wrong. It was about showing what is possible when belief and action align. This stage also demanded generosity of spirit, though not in ways that diminished power. Influence was shared strategically. Knowledge, insight, and opportunities were given to those who demonstrated alignment with vision, not entitlement. Legacy was not in money alone. It was in the ability to show others the method of rising without permission, without shortcuts, without compromise. The queen understood that true power multiplies when it inspires, and it endures when it teaches. The financial milestone, turning a mere $100 into $10,000, was monumental, yes. But the deeper victory lay in mastery over self. The queen had proven that external doubt is powerless against internal resolve. That laughter can be converted into motivation. That patience and discipline, when applied consistently, outweigh fleeting judgments or dismissive voices. In reflection, the journey had revealed patterns invisible to the casual observer. The world favors spectacle over subtlety, noise over strategy, and certainty over discipline. Those who rise quietly gain advantage because they operate outside the expectations of others. The queen had turned this truth into action, creating a path that was uniquely hers and untouchable by skepticism. Now the final stage was about impact. The fortune had become a tool, the system a legacy. The queen had reached a point where the world could no longer define her worth, for she had defined it herself. Every past mockery, every skeptical glance, and every underestimated effort had been converted into power. The laughter that once tried to diminish her had been replaced by respect, acknowledgement, and ultimately inspiration. The story concludes not with a declaration but with presence. The queen's journey from $100 start to $10,000 in realized wealth proves that true rise does not need validation. It proves that underestimated beginnings can become unstoppable forces. It proves that the quiet, patient, and intentional approach always outlasts noise. The crown is not given. It is earned, and it shines brightest when built in silence. This is more than a story of money. It is a story of sovereignty, strategy, and triumph against expectation. The $100 investment was never just about profit. It was about proving that queens do not ask permission to rise. They do not wait for approval, applause, or recognition. They rise because they are capable, because they are disciplined, and because they refuse to let anyone else dictate their worth. And with that, the journey is complete. The queen has arrived not with boastful fanfare, but with undeniable presence. She has transformed doubt into opportunity, laughter into momentum, and a small start into a fortune. The lesson is clear. Beginnings do not determine endings, but discipline, patience, and vision do.